Welcome back to the Year of Plenty podcast, the show to help you get closer to your food source and learn the skills to make every year a year of plenty. We are all about building more resilient humans through food here, and I'm so pumped that you're here along for the ride. Today's episode is a conversation with Tim Frost all about oyster mushroom foraging. Tim is a wild mushroom identification expert and outdoor educator. He uploads a lot of great content on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, and the content covers edible and medicinal mushrooms and plant identification, cooking, storing wild foods, as well as more general foraging tips. So, great guest for the Year of Plenty podcast. All right, that's it. Get ready to learn all about oyster mushroom foraging from Tim. Tim, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Good. How are you guys?
Good.
We are doing great. It's been, I feel like at the last few podcasts I've always kind of started it with, it's been an interesting summer here. But yeah, I mean, again, we just got snow in June, like
oh my.
3 days ago. I think the last two podcasts I've started with, we just had snow, but it just keeps on coming.
I have the opposite extreme here. So it's been in the mid 90s for the past 4 days, I think. And it's going to be that way for at least 3 or 4 more. So yeah, we got the heat down. We're not really that far south, but south of you, south and east. So
you're in Indiana, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
And remind me if I'm wrong, but I think that is where your forager and your name is Hoosier Forager, right? Is that how you say it?
It's close. It's Hoosier. But there's a little bit of like, I don't really know exactly where the term Hoosier comes from, but it used to be like a derogatory term for people who come from Indiana, like, oh, there's a Hoosier. One of the stories where that came from was somebody got in a bar fight and somebody cut their ear off, and they're like, whose ear is this? And so I don't know if that's true. I have no idea. But yeah, I'm from Indiana. And so I really have a cool opportunity to have the same username on all my profiles and everything. So it's really easy. But I don't know how I lucked out with that. But that's really fun.
Well, hopefully that'd be fun if that story would be real. You know?
Very well could be.
It could be. I have no idea.
The way things used to be.
Right? I cannot attest to the truthfulness of that story, but I have heard that from many sources. So
yeah. So I wanted to have you on to talk about oyster mushrooms today. Definitely like a favorite mushroom of mine and many other foragers out there, and one that people, beginner foragers, if they don't know about it already, definitely should learn because it's very abundant. And we'll get into that in a bit. We'll dive deep into oysters today. But I'm just curious, like, could you share with us your kind of like your initial mushroom hunting, journey, how you got into it, and maybe like maybe even have a story that has to do with oysters there. I don't know, but I'm just curious about how you got started.
Well, kind of. So my first I was looking for morels first. I used to do that for when I was a kid with my grandpa. And a few years ago, I was just like, you know what? I'm going to go look for you got me saying oyster now. I'm going to go look for morels this spring. And so I went looking and I didn't find one single morel. So my journey started with failure, which often is something when you're learning something new. That's what happens, and that's okay. That's part of my motivation to do the stuff on socials, is trying to inspire people to like just get out and try it and do the thing. Like, you don't have to have a mycology degree. You can just start wherever you're at. But I went looking for morels, didn't find any, but I found what I now know as a pheasant back, or Ceroporus squamosus. And I was like, dang, that's cool looking. What is that thing? And so I just kind of like started looking into it, and I'm like, oh, you can eat that? Okay.
Right.
All right. Let's go here. So I just started diving in, and I just dove head deep into the foraging world for fungi, especially when I first started out. Watched a lot of YouTube from like Adam Harriton's Learn Your Land was hugely beneficial for me because he lives in Western Pennsylvania. So he's in the same general area as I am. So we have a lot of similarities of what's growing in our area. And that dude is super knowledgeable. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And so that was my first find of a mushroom was Cereoporus squamosus. And I'm still not good at finding morels, which is totally cool with me. That's fine. It's like 2 seasons ago, I found like 3 or 4. And then this year I found 8.
Nice.
So,
Yeah.
I'm getting better, but I
slowly progressing, right?
Yeah. Still not good at finding morels, which is totally fine because I know it's a hot take, especially in the Midwest. Morels are not my favorite. Sorry, don't hate me.
That's fine. Unpopular opinion.
Right. Yeah. Totally hot take. I understand. But yeah, that's kind of how I got my start. And then I just got so fascinated. I had no idea there were so many mushrooms out there that were edible, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
But then as soon as I started really getting into that, I ran like straight into like edible plants and medicinal plants. And I ran head first into herbalism. And I'm like, wow, this is just like a whole new world that just opened up. And so I just kept diving deeper and deeper and deeper. And the rest is history. And just trying to help people learn what I've learned is along the way and what I'm continuing to learn. Because that's the thing that I found. I joined a lot of Facebook groups. There are a lot of Facebook mushroom groups. And while they are helpful, there's a lot of like shaming in the community. If somebody asks, what is this? And they get made fun of or whatever. And it's like, that shouldn't be that way. And I still don't argue with people to this day. If they want to argue about, the taxonomic revision that just happened and it's now called this instead of this, like, that's fine with me. I'm here to, it should never be about that. I'm here to educate people and I'm here to help them see what's available to them out there. And everyone starts somewhere. And so you have to be nice to people and teach them. So that's kind of why I started Hoosier Forager, was just to show people that everyday people like me can get out and learn and really find a whole lot of value from it. And I don't have a mycology degree. I'm not a clinical herbalist. I don't have a botany degree. I'm just somebody who's thirsty to learn. And that's really all it takes.
Definitely.
That is all it takes. I would agree with that. Like, follow your curiosity, right? Like, and
Absolutely.
if that's the thing that you can get really like jacked about, and that's what gets you outside and gets you like connected to nature and thinking about your food, and I'm all about it. Like, that's even better. And I agree with the scientific names and stuff. Like, I'd like to really be at the point where I can just rattle them off. But it's not necessary to start foraging or to be a forager at all.
It's a cool parlor trick, though.
It is cool. I have a couple buddies at work that are kind of getting into it with me, and they'll go with me. I'm like, hey, do you want to walk around the woods and shout Harry Potter spells at people? Because that's what you're doing. You're just like shouting like, Latin names at things and pointing. And it's like, oh, you're just like Harry Potter. You're just casting spells on people. So that's kind of a running joke that I have with a couple of my friends, but that's true. I have found that sometimes there is a necessity for scientific names because sometimes common names for plants and mushrooms both kind of blend between species, and sometimes that's important and sometimes it's not so important. Not long ago somebody asked what an oyster mushroom was actually, and I said, yeah, that's Pleurotus austratus. And somebody was like, oh, well, technically now that Pleurotus, if you check on the iNaturalist, Pleurotus is now in its own complex and da. I'm like, okay, cool, thanks. Like, I don't know. I'm not going to like debate all that. And, I'm not super like into the taxonomic revision stuff. So as long as I can identify it well and identify it confidently, and that's really what most people are looking for. However, sometimes when people give misinformation, which happens a lot too, you kind of sometimes have to break out the Latin binomials because you're like, no, technically that's not right. But I try to keep that at bay because also, again, I'm trying not to come off like arrogant or anything like that. So you try to just kind of use common names if possible, but sometimes it is necessary.
Definitely. Right. What would you say it is about oyster mushrooms that makes you so excited about them that makes you keep going back to them year after year?
Oysters, I just think they're quite versatile. There's a lot of things that one can do with an oyster mushroom. It's a really easy beginner mushroom to ID as well. So that is super helpful. But the versatility, you can use it, you can dry it, you can cook it fresh, you can powder it and use it for gravy and seasonings and all kinds of good stuff. And I find there are a lot of mushrooms that are that way. But oysters are pretty prolific growers if they have the right conditions. And so, kind of the opposite of morels are kind of the Where's Waldo of mushrooms in my world. Like I just have trouble finding it. I don't have the eyes for them apparently. But I'm really good at finding chicken in the woods, which is not that hard because it's bright orange. But hey, but oysters are something that is pretty easy to spot, especially in the fall and winter because there's not a lot of ground cover. There's not a lot of stuff growing on the ground, so you can see a lot farther out. And they often grow on down trees, so it's a lot easier to spot those. And in the wintertime, there's just not a whole lot here in Indiana as far as fungus is concerned. For edibility, we have enoki, wild enoki, Flammulano paludipes, and then we have some wood ear if it gets a little warm enough, because it can fruit when it's cooler as well. And then oyster, and that's really about all we have here in the wintertime. So also it's just a scarcity thing. There's not a whole lot to choose from here in the winter because we do get pretty cold.
Yeah, I think you really hit all the points there about like why oyster, especially the abundance. That's what I think is so great about them and kind of how they. We'll get into like the season a bit later, but you can, hint it, like you can really find them like all year long in some areas if the conditions are right. And I really like what you said about the visibility because, like morels and many mushrooms that are on the ground, they'll hide but under the leaves and in the high grass. And with oysters, you just focus on those trees and, your success rate goes up a lot, I think.
Yeah, and I'm not a very patient person. I walk pretty quickly. And so I'm not the kind of guy to like take one step every 30 seconds. So I know it takes a lot more patience. That's probably why I don't find as many, just because I'm not patient enough. And that's okay. I'll leave them for the patient people. So
that's right.
I'm also not patient, but I'm crawling on the ground on my hands and knees as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and in Indiana, where I'm looking, there's a lot of leaf cover, so the leaf thing is for real. Unless you find some rather large, like morels, which I did find one 2 years ago that was taller than a Pepsi can. Like it was huge.
Oh, nice!
Wow.
And if they're that big, it's hard to miss them. But most of them are only about 2 to 3 inches tall. And when you're looking through leaves that came down the last fall, it is really difficult to spot them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, sometimes you get like, you learn about a new wild food species, right? And then there's something you learn about it that like really catches your attention and blows your mind. At least it happens to me a lot. So like recently, Lindy and I just got into glacier lilies a ton. And we'll do a podcast about that in the future, but they're like a spring wildflower out here. Like for example, with them, something I learned in a book by Tom Alpel is that supposedly they can produce their own heat and melt snow around them, which I thought was crazy. Like,
wow, that's cool.
A plant that can do that. So I'm curious if you know any fun facts about oyster mushrooms like that where you maybe learned them. You're like, whoa, this is kind of cool.
I'm trying to think. Let's see. Oysters. Well, I think one cool thing about oysters is how they grow. Particularly in some of the time that you can find them growing singly or in like maybe 2 or 3 together in smaller clusters. And then other times you'll find clusters like huge clusters growing together. And I find that so cool that, depending on, I'm not sure how that determines whether it grows. And I found single oysters as big as 8 or 10 inches across.
Wow.
So it's really cool to just see the diversity and how it works. And then, of course, the diversity in species. There are so many different oyster mushrooms out there in that Pleurotus genus. There's a lot. And there's a lot of different colors. There's a lot of different textures and things, and even growing seasons, as you mentioned earlier. So it's quite diverse. I mean, there are several different morels for that. There's black morels, and there's blonde morels, and there's Morchella diminutiva, which is like the really small, tiny morels. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of that as well. But usually they're kind of like oysters. They are, depending on where you're in the country, they do or may not grow there. And it's the same with oysters. There's a lot of diversity in the genus, but here we only have 3 or 4 typically that I know of, different types of oysters. So that's really
the diversity is super cool about them. Like, I just saw, even, I think it's just a cultivated one, but I just saw like a pink oyster.
I've seen those. Yeah.
It's crazy. We'll get into the varieties in a sec here. I want to talk about just some of the little differences. I actually found a really cool fun fact about oysters that I want to share quick. And I don't know if you have ever read this, but supposedly oysters are carnivorous mushrooms. Have you heard of this?
Oh yes, they can eat the little like nematodes or something.
Yeah. I see. That's something like when I'm like, what?
I forgot about that.
We got like a vegan food here that like eats meat, right? Like, and supposedly I did some
those tricksters.
So I read a study so the oysters are wood rotters. We kind of alluded to them growing on trees. They're saprobes, like they come in, decay the trees, and what is like, or the wood itself, the trees are pretty low in protein. So what do? They found some weird niche in nature to eat worms, like the little nematodes. And where they attach to the wood, they'll grow these hyphae, like little filaments from the mycelium, I guess. And on that, they have these little lollipop-like structures. And when like the nematodes, the worms come, they touch those things explode, numb the nematodes to the point where they just die like pretty quick. Then the oysters, like the hyphae, kind of grow around that, turn them into a slurry, and just like absorb the worms for their protein and nutrients.
That sounds so gross.
Yeah,
but like, I would have never thought.
It's so cool.
I mean, you hear about I think it's there's one, I think it's a cordyceps. Might be wrong, but it actually, I think it infects the brains of ants, and then or other insects, and then basically turn them into zombies almost. Control the insects to go to a certain point, and then just like burst out of their head and spread their spores. So fungi are crazy like that.
Yeah, there's some weird dudes for sure, and I don't know a whole lot about cordyceps.
I don't either.
But I do know that they grow out of insect bodies. But there's a whole bunch of different kinds. Some are cultivated even because they are apparently medicinal in some way. But I have not gotten to study cordyceps or look into cordyceps. I've never really found any here, but that doesn't mean that they aren't here. I'm sure that they probably are, but I've never really looked into that. But yeah, they're some wild dudes, man.
It sounds like they're getting ready for the world takeover. They start with ants and keep moving their way up.
Yeah,
probably what happened at some point. At some
Forager's
point.
Conspiracy.
It's just weird how those organisms on Earth find their weird little niche like that, and it works. I also read that the oysters now were first cultivated in Germany, actually, in like the early 1900s for World War I, like as a food to feed people. So
wow, that's cool. Fact. They are very easy to cultivate.
Right.
I do some social media posts for Northspore on occasion. They'll send me a couple kits, and I'll I'll kind of post about their spray and grow kits and stuff like that, and people can follow along and see how it grows. And yeah, oyster is one of those that is a real easy cultivator. It fruits really easily. It's not super fussy about temperature and humidity. As long as you give it some, it'll give you something back.
Right.
It's not very picky at all. So yeah, it's pretty easy for that.
Homesteaders listening, this is a good one for you to start if you want to introduce mushrooms on your homestead,
Yes.
like for some projects.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
I actually follow a homesteader account that was posting about growing oyster mushrooms this past winter. I can't remember who it was now. I follow several homesteader accounts, but yeah. They were doing that.
It's an easy one, and you can literally just get mushroom logs, like inoculate them with the spore, keep them wet, and you can actually, I read this in Mushrooms Demystified, the pretty popular book that a lot of foragers will have in their bookshelf, but he was saying into the author David Aurora that you can even take a wild log, if depending on how big it is, obviously, but you can drag that home, and as long as you keep it moist, it'll keep producing mushrooms pretty regularly. Whoa. But I would recommend leave it in nature, leave it where it is, and then grow
Let nature
your own.
Do what it does.
Right. Yeah, because they will typically most mushrooms will typically fruit in the same place or near the same place pretty much every year until whatever nutrient for saprodes in the wood that they're feeding on has been depleted. So chicken of the woods, oysters, all of those saprobes, lion's mane, all of those will continue to fruit as long as the conditions are right every year until whatever their mycelium are feeding on is depleted. So once you find a spot, you can kind of go back and check every year for a while, and you'll probably be given some results.
That's right. Yep. And we do that pretty regularly. Like every time we find one, we use Onyx, the mapping system. We drop it.
There you go.
Poldy's Onyx is absurd. There are so many points.
Yeah, it's starting to get a bit overwhelming.
It's just one big red mark at this point.
Oh my gosh.
Then you can I started to do the foraging stuff green now, so I can differentiate.
So it's a Christmas tree now. Got it.
I'm doing it green with the mushroom logo. So now everything foraging is the mushroom logo in green. But yeah, then you can look for those. Like if it's like coming close to the season, you're like, well, when did we get oysters last year and where? Just check on your map and check the time and be like, okay, well, around that time I'm gonna, if the weather's been pretty similar in conditions, I'll be there again and see if I can get some more, and it works. So I wanna move on a bit to talk about the varieties that and some of the ID factors for oysters.
Okay.
Now let's talk about like the ones you usually oyster-wise, the varieties that you kind of run into. And I want to preface real quick with I was learning that there's like 40 to 200 species of the Pleurotus, the genus of the oysters. Way too many that we can cover here, but I think there's I would say 2 common ones that people will find mostly throughout the US. So which ones do you usually run into?
So there are a couple that we usually run into, and there are a couple that are becoming more prevalent, or every once in a while you'll find a little more rarely. But the 2 that I run into here are Pleurotus austriatus, which is the fall oyster mushroom. So that fruits usually in mid to late fall through winter until it gets really, really cold. And then during the summer and spring months, you have Pleurotus pulmonarius, or the lung oyster. And it's called the lung oyster because it's shaped like a lung, and it's white. Those are the 2 most common. Here in Indiana, we also have Pleurotus levis, Levis. I think that's how you say it. I've never found it myself, but it was in my mushroom certification courses when I took it, and so I know it exists. I believe that's the veiled oyster is the common name. I have not seen that, but I know it's here in Indiana because I've seen it in the Indiana mushroom pages before. So that one grows. I think that's another spring to summer type oyster mushroom. And then we are starting to see a lot of Pleurotus citrinopileatus. I could never say it right the first time. It's the yellow or golden oyster.
Right.
That was actually it's an Asian species that kind of escaped the captivity, and it was kind of spreading around. I have seen a couple cases of that in Indiana, like in the northeast corner. I've not seen it in my area personally, and I don't know of anyone who's found it here, but eventually that's going to make its way across the country because it is an invasive species, but it's just as delicious as the others. So,
the golden ones, I found a lot of those when I was still in Wisconsin, jumping around the woods there. And they're nice because they do pop a lot more, even more so than the normal like white and white oysters. They're just like in your face, kind of like the chicken of the woods. Real quick though, hold your thought. I heard you say mushroom certification course. What is that all about? Where did you do that?
Oh boy, Poldy. Bring up a sore subject, but so I in Indiana, part of being able to sell mushrooms here requires some certifications that I have taken. I paid a decent amount of money for, and I took all the classes. I passed all the tests. And then a month after I sent all that in, the state of Indiana says, we're not certifying that anymore.
Oh my God.
What?
So by title, I used to be a certified wild edible mushroom identification expert. Say that.
That's cool.
Yeah.
How would they get rid of that?
I still say that, but I just dropped the certified off because I'm technically not certified by the state anymore because they don't do it. However, I still took the test. I still passed them all. I still paid a decent amount of money to get that title. So I still use it. So that it was really cool to take that class. I also took a morel certification course as well to ID morels, because in order to sell those in Indiana, you have to have passed the separate course along with some other governmental red tape. But yes, so I am a bit of an expert in that way, but I can't say I'm certified anymore.
Yeah, that is a bummer. I thought it might have been something like, the extension that the state does. Like the state will have like Wisconsin horticulture extension. So I thought it might have been maybe a course like that you could just take. Yeah. That would have been cool.
This is through the Hoosier Mushroom Society in Indiana. Gives out, or doesn't give out. They teach those courses. But we do have that too. We have Purdue here in Indiana, which is a big ag school, and Purdue has agriculture extension office in most counties. So you can call and they can help you, with all kinds of gardening questions and all kinds of things, as well as mushroom questions and stuff like that too. So that is a helpful resource for folks if they have questions like that. I've also befriended the naturalists at my local state park, which is about 10 minutes from my house. I fill in for them from time to time at the nature center, and it's really cool. They were able to help me out with like letters of recommendation that I needed for that certification that we just spoke of. And yeah, it's just cool to be able to like talk mushrooms with people. So yeah, it's cool that they that let me do that from time to time and just kind of help out when I can. And that's just part of my foraging philosophy overall, is to practice reciprocity. And another way to do that is to pass along knowledge to everybody else and not keep it to yourself.
Definitely.
Amongst many other ways, but that's one of my favorite ways too.
Definitely. I think it's so important to start teaching other people the ways of the world that are now gone,
Common knowledge back in the day.
Yeah.
We knew all of this stuff and then we forgot about it. And now we're coming back to it, and people think, you're talking about medicinal plants and mushrooms and stuff, and they look at you like you're crazy, but you're like, dude, this was like state of the art a couple hundred years ago.
Survival.
Yeah. So, and even farther back, but way back in the days of the caveman and stuff, it's like that's what they were doing. They didn't have doctors to go to. They didn't have YouTube. They definitely didn't have Google or the internet. So they had to pass it along to their kids, and their kids passed it along to their kids, and that's how it happened. So,
all right,
just trying to do my part with that.
Yeah,
love that.
That's
so
awesome.
going back to oysters, let's talk about ID a little bit. So you mentioned it too. The Pleurotus austriatus, which is like more, just to recap real quick, that's more winter, spring, fall, I would say. And then the more summer heavy one is the Plumarius, I think it is. Pleurotus plumarius, right?
Pulmonarius, yeah. So if you think like pulmonary system, like your
lung.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, that's true. The regular kind of winter oyster is fall into winter and sometimes into spring if it's cool enough. And then the pulmonarius,
like in Montana here,
late spring and yeah, when it's still snowing in June. Golly, that's terrible.
Yeah, we get the winter and fall oyster. Like I just found some in May, even it was like mid-May.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I found the week of Christmas here. So
wow.
Yeah, some of the pictures I sent you, like that big giant cluster that I found, that was on December 24th. I was out working on December 24th.
Merry Christmas.
I know, right?
Let me pull up
I'm a
some
sucker
pictures.
for those. Yeah, go ahead.
And then we can kind of.
That's one I sent you the short movie clip of too, because I'm a sucker for a good gill shot, and when you just turn that whole cluster over, sweet
gill shots, baby. Let's go.
Sweet gills.
This one.
That's left. The giant oyster that was like 8 inches across.
My goodness.
So it's the cluster video right next to my cheesy picture there. Yeah, that one there. That's the video of me. It was growing on that beech tree right behind it.
Oh my God.
I just took a video of it because the gills were just so perfect and beautiful. There were no bugs on it. It was just like the most pristine looking cluster I've ever seen. And then there's a picture of that same cluster just to the left. That's the
let's pull that
just
up.
A still picture of that cluster. It was still on the tree before I took it off. But man, it was the most beautiful cluster. And that same day is when I found that giant one on the other end of the park where I was at.
Wow.
So yeah, it was a prolific mushroom day for me.
That's
I think
cool.
this is a good picture to kind of talk about maybe some of the ID factors on them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so oyster mushrooms. So for Austriatus, there's a lot of similarities between the IDs for oysters between species, but I kind of broke it down per species because there's a little bit of difference. So for Austriatus, it has a short, stubby little stipe, as you can see, and it's usually kind of turned because it grows kind of out.
For the people listening,
it's usually
that's
not
the stem.
Yes, that is the stem.
Yeah.
And oyster mushrooms have decurrent gills, which means the gills do not stop at the cap where the cap meets the stem. It continues down the stem, as you can see in that picture there. The gills continue on down that short, stubby stem. It has a bit of a fishy type smell to it as well. The oyster mushroom does. And we talked about this as well. They are saprophytic, so they grow directly from wood, which is an ID feature. The winter oyster, Austriatus, is a tan to grayish brown most of the time in color. It's usually darker when it's wet on the top, and it can get pretty light tan on the top as well. As it ages, it actually gets a little leathery on the top. And there's another picture of some close up that were a little older, and you can kind of see the wrinkles in the cap right there. Yeah. You can kind of see some wrinkles up there on that top mushroom. It kind of gets like a leathery kind of plasticky feel to the top of it. But those are actually, I wish I could have sent you the whole video, but that stump there, it was in the middle of winter and there was snow all over the place. So those were growing while it was snowing.
That's sweet.
And it usually fruits around 40 to 60 degrees or so. Mm-hmm. So it can fruit, even into, just like I said, I found those other ones on December 24th. So it can go here in Indiana, the coldest part of winter is usually in January. So that's when you usually stop finding them. And then after it gets really cold, it starts to creep back up just a little bit. And then if it rains and it hits just the right temperatures, they can fruit again just before spring starts. If we hit the right temperature and moisture stuff. So, and then the last thing I have is the spore print is a white to light lilac spore print for Austriacus.
Yep. And that's something we don't always talk about here, but like if you're unsure, definitely take a spore print, just set it on a dark piece of paper overnight with like a bowl or a box above it. And the next day it'll have basically a print of the mushroom. And with oysters, it looks so cool. Like you'll have a piece of art.
Yeah.
I actually gave some to my grandma and my mom for Christmas because
that's cool.
Like they have it hanging on their wall now. You know, it looks so cool.
Yeah. Spore prints are cool. And sometimes they are a very good indicator. For example, the other winter mushroom, I know we're not talking about that today, but enoki has a toxic lookalike, deadly Galerina marginata. And one of the easy ways to tell it apart is the spore print. Galerina has a brown spore print, whereas enoki has a white spore print. But the mushrooms look very similar in color. They kind of grow in the same conditions. And so you can actually have enoki and Galerina growing on the same log at the same time. So sometimes spore print is very important. Other times it's just a confirmation step. But I always recommend people, especially when you're first starting out, if you know what spore print you should be looking for. If you don't, look it up. That's a pretty easy kind of spec that you can find on the internet about, what spore print color you should see. And then you can take a spore print to be absolutely sure. And even some of them give off spores really fast. I've taken enoki spore prints in less than 2 hours. You pull it up and there's still all kinds of spores. So the longer the better. But sometimes they do release spores a little faster.
Right. And I just want to add to the ID factors you talked about. For me, I sometimes get a fishy smell, but usually it's more of like a licorice, like anise kind of smell
licorice,
for me.
Yeah. And I'm terrible at describing smells too, or tastes. So
well, it's tough. I think it's not always like, I don't think you should always go off a smell with mushrooms.
No, not always.
Especially oyster can kind of fluctuate, it seems like. And then we have talked about it throughout a bit, but they do tend to grow in these clusters, like shelves almost, like coming from one central. Usually the way I see them, especially out here, the ones in Montana, it's like one big clump that they're all kind of like growing out of. And look up more pictures. I mean, I guess we can share the one you were like this one again.
Yeah, that big cluster was growing at the base of that beech tree. And I saw that probably 50 yards off on the other side of a ravine. I was like, oh, there's something over there. I couldn't tell what it was, but I knew, I'm like, that doesn't look like that beech tree. And so I lucked out on that one for sure. Yeah. Early Christmas present for
all right.
Yeah.
And then also I would say that when they're smaller, what I see is that the margins, so the edges of the cap kind of bent inward, like down, like an umbrella.
Yeah, it's kind of umbrella-like, and it's really smooth. And as they grow, they kind of do this, and they kind of will oftentimes split. You'll see split caps like this because it grows and turns almost concave. As it ages, like that large one that I had in that other picture, close up, you can't really see. But like, actually, I think if you look at the picture of me holding of me actually next to that one.
You can see it.
Yeah, so I found both of those that day. You can kind of see how that cap is split. It's kind of irregular shaped, but when they're young, it's a very regular, like smooth kidney type shape. And the margin is kind of almost curled over, like you said.
Yeah, almost like more like a vase, like a chanterelle a little bit. And I feel like the summer ones, the plumarius, the lung oyster mushroom, I'm just gonna call it that one. I feel like tends to be more like that, at least from my experience. But shapes can vary.
Absolutely.
And I think the decurrent gills, like you were saying, that's definitely a big one to look for. Those are cool because when you flip the mushroom around, they're pretty paper thin and pretty evenly spaced, so you can just kind of like take your finger and kind of play them like, I don't know, like a guitar almost.
A little harp.
or like when you're flipping through a book.
Harp.
Yeah.
Kind of like that. I like that
pages in a book. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's cool.
Are there any poisonous lookalikes for oysters that you're aware of?
Not that I am aware of. There are no poisonous looks-like, but there are some lookalikes. Oh, there's some young ones. Yeah, see how smooth those edges are on those. There are some lookalikes that are edible, and there are some lookalikes that aren't edible, but I don't know of any that are necessarily toxic. Edible species, there's an elm oyster that grows specifically from elm trees. It is edible. There is a veiled oyster that we talked about earlier. That's actually Pleurotus dryinus. Sorry, wrong name. Don't hate me. The veiled oyster is another one, but those are both edible, but there are several other ones as well that are lookalikes that are edible that aren't necessarily oysters. But there are a lot of lookalikes. There's a mock oyster, which is like an orange to reddish orange color, and the cap is often fuzzy.
We have that also, out here. I've seen that.
Also, talk about smell. Those things got some stank on them. I'm telling you what.
Yeah.
They most of the time they are stinky. So that is another really easy factor to use your nose, because the nose can pick that up pretty fast.
I think some of the other lookalikes that you just mentioned are also taste really bitter.
I've never eaten elm or veiled oyster before, so I'm not sure.
Not elm. Elm is pretty tasty. I've had elm, but
okay.
I don't know if it's still. I just read in Tom Volk's foraging blog, Dr. Volk, that there's some lookalikes that you'll know, like if you try them, you will not want to eat them. They're super bitter.
Oh yeah. There's angel wings. They're not toxic. They grow on conifers.
Those some people have, like you were mentioning, Learn Your Land earlier, Adam Harrison.
Yeah,
he has a whole video on.
Yes.
How that there have been some cases of people dying, and they kind of linked
mostly
it to,
in China.
Yeah, like old people
like
that already were compromised.
50 people got sick and 15 died.
Yeah, and there's a lot of mushrooms like that. I mean, for example, chicken of the woods, there's a variety of chicken that grows on conifers, and there's a lot of people saying that it's toxic and not toxic, and there's some debate back and forth. And Adam actually he does a really good job at addressing those controversial type hot take mushrooms. He explains it so eloquently, and I always love listening to that. But basically it was the same kind of thing, like it's necessarily not toxic, but you may be more likely to have a reaction if you eat chicken of the woods that's growing on a conifer versus chicken of the woods that's growing on some other hardwood or something.
Right.
So yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with your body, but I don't think that there's any toxicity there.
Yeah. And the other oysters we've been talking about, nothing really to worry about there. But even with those, I would recommend, if there's a beginner listening right now, anytime you try a wild food, start with a little bit and just see how
Absolutely.
You feel, because everyone has different allergies and stuff like that. So
even non-toxic mushrooms can cause gastrointestinal distress. We'll call it that. So it's always recommended to start with a very small portion, see how your body handles it, and then kind of, if you're good with it, then kind of move forward. So that's a great tip.
Yeah, we've got some friends that don't do so well with like morels, for example. So they'll find them and they won't eat them.
And in my morel class, they said consider morels toxic if they are not cooked well. So you have to make sure to cook your mushrooms well. There's only like a couple mushrooms that I know of, or maybe even one, tremella, that you can eat raw. And it's it doesn't really taste that good, so I don't know why people do it. It's usually just to freak people out, but it's called, the common name is witch's butter. But yeah, make sure and cook them thoroughly. Make sure and do your homework there. And if anyone who's a beginning forager out there, one of the things that I grew in my learning from is that always find at least 3 sources that confirm what you're looking for, and don't make it fit. Don't shoehorn it in. So find a field guide that you can go through. Okay, this is the right cap, it's the right gills, it's the right substrate, it's the right time of year. Even sometimes people are like, oh, I found this, and we're like, there's no way it can be that. It's not that time of year. It doesn't fruit in that time. So don't try and make it. If it fits 3 out of the 4, always go to your second source, but always befriend somebody who is way more knowledgeable than you. I know some people that, holy cow, like as much as I know, it's just a drop in the bucket compared to these guys. And so I will just send them. Sometimes I'll send them a picture. I'm like, I think it's this, but like, are you, can you help me out? Can you confirm this? And then also Facebook groups can be pretty helpful. So at least find 3 resources that will back up what you think it is before you move forward, especially with some stuff that can be non-beginner mushrooms, like enoki, for example. I wouldn't consider that a beginner's mushroom because it has some severely toxic lookalikes.
Totally.
But with oysters, I mean, you may make a mistake and eat something that doesn't taste great, but if it looks like an oyster, it probably may just upset your stomach or something, but it's not going to kill you. So
yeah.
Right.
And always do more research. I probably don't say it enough on the podcast, but I got to throw it in. Like, do your own research, like you said, find some mentors you can work with. And there's so many, I think there's 2,000 edible mushrooms out there and like 15,000 or something in general. So there might, we can never know about every species out there. You'd be some super genius.
Start where you are. That's the key.
Yeah.
Like, I'm out foraging a lot and I'll run into people at the state park or something. And they're just so fascinated by it. If they see I have a handful of something, like, oh, you can eat those? And, invariably we'll get talking about things. And most people will say the same thing to me every time. I would love to do it, but I'm scared to eat the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I see that. And that, I mean, it's good to have a healthy respect of it. But a lot of times the antidote to fear is not being brave. It's just education. We fear what we don't know. And Definitely. Again, that's the reason I started my social media, is just to show people that you don't have to be scared to start. Just make sure and do your research and just keep growing. Just do what you can and start where you are and just get out there, because there's so much out there to learn. There's so much out there to do with foraging. I look at foraging like an onion, and I know this isn't a general foraging podcast, so I'll keep all that to myself. But there's so many layers to foraging. There's always something new to learn. So if you can come at it with that growth mindset and not ever think that you've arrived, that is the best posture to have.
Yeah,
that's right.
I know that you can always go down to your local 4-H county extension office and ask them for help as well, or your local colleges if you're a little bit worried or nervous about asking another expert.
Yeah, absolutely.
And looking dumb, which you never look dumb. It's always better to look a little dumb, and get the right answer. But
absolutely,
definitely just reach out to somebody. Yeah.
And I know in Indiana, in state parks, we can forage mushrooms in state parks here. Other states you may or may not. So also make sure and check with your local laws to make sure you're staying within the right side of the law there. But here you can forage a state park. So I can, if I'm a new person and I find a mushroom, take it up to the naturalist office and they will help you ID it. They're more than welcome to share their knowledge. That's what they're there for. So make use of them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Love it.
Definitely.
So in terms of like habitat for the oysters, what specific types of trees are you usually looking for, and what kind of like terrain would you say you usually run into them?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, they are saprophytic, so they grow on dead and dying wood. They feed on the stuff inside dead and dying wood. So a lot of times you're looking on the ground for down logs. They like that. I have found them growing on trees that are still standing. It's quite rare, but I have found some. That picture that you showed a little earlier with just a few of them in my hand, those were actually found on a standing tree. And that giant cluster was found on a standing beech tree that was probably 80 feet tall. But they do mostly grow on down trees or like standing stags, like trees that have broken off and the stump is still there. So I always look for dead, dying, and down trees. That is an easier said than done in the spring and summer with all the ground cover. But in the fall and winter for the fall oysters, you can see way farther, so it's a lot easier. But they do like hardwoods. They prefer hardwoods like beech, oak, ash, but they don't grow on a specific species of tree, but they do prefer hardwoods.
Unless you're out here in Montana, because we only have a handful of hardwood deciduous trees. So you usually find them on cottonwoods and aspen, but that's also all you really have here around the river bottoms. Yeah. That's the only place I would really go looking for oysters if you want to be efficient with your time. If you're in like the Mountain West. Yeah. Oaks too. I know oaks they prefer. I did read alder too. That's one we sometimes have out here. So that's one I'll have to look for. But I would say, yeah, from my experience, usually like oak, the beech, I would say, like you said, and then at least out here, cottonwood and alder. Cottonwood and aspen. And I think the aspen is another like little subspecies too. The one that grows in aspens, it's like Papilinius, Pleurotus papilinius, or something like that. The name.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, we don't have aspen trees in Indiana that I know of.
Yeah, so it's just I mean, every region's going to be a little different there. One thing I noticed, at least out here, that compared to Wisconsin, is that in Montana, all the oysters I've found so far have all been at the base of the stump. And, or, if it's a
below the 3-foot mark.
Yeah. At least if there's a stump, like it's still part of the tree standing. And in Wisconsin, I've often found them like chest height, on still standing trees. So that's another thing that it can vary. Yeah.
Yeah. The only ones I've ever found on a standing tree or like that giant cluster that I found, and that was right at the base of that beech tree, as you can see in the picture. It was right there on pretty much touching the ground almost in the bottom of that cluster. So yeah, I've not seen them growing like way high up in the tree. I have seen pheasantback and dryad saddle doing that a lot. I actually have a tree in my backyard that does that from time to time, way up high, like 30 feet in the air. But yeah, I've not really seen oysters do that here, but I'm not saying it's impossible, but yeah, I've not seen it myself.
Yeah. I love pheasantbacks too. We don't have those out here. So, you mentioned that you can find oysters throughout the year, but is there like an optimal time, like where you're like, okay, this is the month now that I'm going to look for oysters?
Winter oysters, it kind of depends on the weather because mushrooms are not very predictable as far as scheduling is concerned. They know when the temperatures are right and when the moisture level that they like to fruit in are right, and that's when they do the thing. So I like this year in particular was pretty early. People are already finding chicken in the woods here, and if it has the right conditions, if it's wet enough, if it's warm enough, it'll grow. For me, winter oysters are usually in the warmer part of the cooler months, if that makes sense. So like October, November, and like into December. Like I think January most of the time is too cold. But again, usually when we get into March and April, you'll kind of see them again because it's starting to warm up just enough. And if we have some rain, that they'll start fruiting. But yeah, probably I would say October through December is the time that I find them the most in my area here in East Central Indiana.
Gotcha.
Cool.
So when you're out there foraging for oyster mushrooms, what specific signs are you looking for to see if it's in its prime or it's well beyond its prime?
Yeah. So when oysters get old, they usually get pretty mushy. So if they're squishy, that I usually leave them alone. Also, bugs love mushrooms. So that giant cluster, there were no bugs on it. It was just like, it was a Christmas miracle, man. That's all I can say. Like there were no bugs. They were perfect. They were nice and firm. But yeah, you want to look for some nice firm flesh on the mushroom. I'll still take them home if it has a few bugs, because you can just take your like mushroom knife that I use has a little brush on the back end of it, and you can just kind of brush them off. So I'll still take it if it has a little bit of bugs, but if like it's infested and crawling with bugs, I just leave it to them because they've got squatters' rights. So
have you found any method for like getting some of the bugs out? If they're in the flesh, or just kind of pass on them?
Most of the bugs I see are in the gills So in the in the spore surfaces. So like I said, there's not a whole lot of gear you need for mushroom hunting. A bag and a knife usually, and that's pretty much all you need. But I have a mushroom knife that has a little brush that helps get in the between those gills to brush them out. But you could use, I just go buy a cheap paintbrush at the dollar store. You can do the same thing.
Right.
It doesn't have to be a mushroom knife, but any kind of like soft-ish bristled brush, you want a little bit of firmness to it, so it'll pick through the gills and kind of sweep them out. So you don't want super soft bristles, but any kind of a brush usually works the best. And also, as a mushroom hunter, you're kind of obligated to pot, give a little spank. So that usually help knock some of the loose ones out too. When you find it, you got to give it a little spank. That also helps. Gauge the firmness of the mushroom. But also I usually do an ASMR video at the end of the year of me just spanking a bunch of mushrooms and all the cool sounds that you get in foraging. So,
you know what? I have not yet spanked any mushrooms, and I feel like I've missed out.
It's a thing.
It's satisfying.
Especially with like, puffballs like Calvacia gigantea, they get really large, and as long as they're firm inside, they're good to eat. And so one of the ways you can tell if they're firm is thump it like a watermelon.
Give them a little tap.
Yeah, give them a little love tap. Show them a little love.
That's funny.
Yeah,
those are
brush
ancestral drums.
Tap.
Yeah.
Yes. Those are the best ways to get most of those bugs out. And then I do as much cleaning in the field as I can, instead of like taking that whole cluster home and just throwing it in a bag. You're letting all those bugs still kind of walk around and get really embedded in there. So I do as much as I can in the field with my mushroom knife, and I'll cut the caps off and kind of leave the other stuff. It helps keep this, spread the spores a little bit if you leave some behind anyway. And so I'll try to do that, because they won't have as many little nooks and crannies, especially in a cluster, for them to hide if you just kind of cut them off of the main cluster body there. And that's just less work for me to do later on. So it's kind of a double win on that.
And I've noticed.
So you're definitely. Oh, go ahead, Poldy.
No, go ahead, Lindy. Go.
Oh, I was gonna say, so you do like cutting them off the tree versus pulling, or?
No, usually if they're wet, they could still be firm and wet. And so if you tried to like twist them off with your hand and they're wet, it's in a wet environment, then you can just smash them and they'll smash to bits. So I usually cut them, and that's in my SMR video too, because it makes the most satisfying squeak noise. Like, when you cut them off. But like the big cluster, it was really dry. And so I could just grab it with both hands and twist it a little bit, and it popped right off. So yeah, if the flesh is firm enough and they're dry, you could just twist them off with your hand. But if they're moist at all, it's probably easier to get them off with a knife, as well as if they're growing real close to the log, because that stipe sometimes is almost non-existent. And so it's like growing right next to the wood almost. And so you can just get that knife blade in there and cut them off, rather than try and get your fingers, because I've got big sausage fingers anyway. So it's easier just to get that knife blade back there and just slice them off. So.
Gotcha.
Yeah. No, those are great tips, especially if there's a wet one. I was just going to say, with the bugs, like, the bugs do love to get the oysters real quick, like you mentioned. And,
sure do.
Often, I like to kind of just, if I know there's some bugs in them, I will still try to cut around them as best I can. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you'd be surprised what you can still save. It can be a bit cumbersome, but, we've had some this year where, there were a good amount of bugs, and I just kind of cut around them, and I ended up having a whole meal still. Now, obviously,
absolutely.
It depends too on how many you get right in that day, but
sure.
Just don't give up right away if you see them being buggies. I guess what I'm trying to say.
And bugs are smart, man. They hide in the little tiny nooks and crannies, and so usually the mushrooms in the closer to the core of that cluster are usually the ones that are most infested, because that's where they're out of the weather, they're out of the elements, and so they're way back in there. So yeah, usually the ones on the peripheral are pretty clean most of the time, and you can just leave the ones behind that are kind of in that central part of the core where they're really hanging out. Because usually they consume that part first anyway. So yeah, you can just leave that behind and let them have their meal, and we can have our meal too. So everybody wins.
That's right. Sweet. I think we covered that kind of like field to table or field to home, at least. Pretty good there. You did make that comment about them being wet. That is a good point. They can be pretty waterlogged sometimes. Sometimes they're past their prime when you get that. When you do bring them home and they're wet, you usually like to dry them off, just kind of let them sit there for a bit, or how do you go about that?
I do pat them off with either a towel or a paper towel or something, and then I can store them in I usually put them in a Ziploc bag with a couple of pieces of paper towel that's a little damp, just to kind of keep the moisture up. But in the wintertime, it's really helpful sometimes because wintertime here can get really cold, and so the bugs won't bother it, and it will still sit there, and it'll actually dehydrate while it's on the tree, and there won't be any bugs. And so it just kind of gives you a head start when they start to get that leathery top and stuff. They're still good. They're just actually dehydrating in nature. So you can even still harvest them at that point, as long as they're not bug ridden or smushy. They're still viable. So you can take those home and continue the drying process, because I keep a lot of mine dried. So you can dry them and then use them later on, reconstitute them or powder them or whatever you want to do.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Ziploc bag. That's interesting to me because I like to do paper bags for the fridge.
Yeah.
Is there a reason you like to use Ziploc, or have you found it to be better in your case?
Well, paper bags will work as well. I just find that if I want to keep my mushrooms moist, like if I'm going to keep them to cook them and not dry them, I think the Ziploc bag just does a better job, because paper will obviously draw the moisture out of the mushroom the longer it's in contact. And so if I want to keep them moist, if I want to cook them the next day or two, I'll put them in the Ziploc just to keep that moisture level a little higher. And then just a barely damp paper towel as well. Like I won't put it in there sopping wet, because you don't want that either. And they usually keep pretty well for at least a few days that way. I've also put them just in a bowl, like a mixing bowl, and then put them in there and just covered them with like a damp paper towel, and put the mixing bowl with the paper towel on top in the fridge. That'll work too. It'll help trap that moisture in there. Just trying to keep it from drying out so much, basically, at that point.
Right. That is a good point. I have found, like, if I wait too long there with the Ziploc, sometimes they can get a bit nasty, but it is, if you know,
slimy,
if you know the next, you're going to eat them the next day or 2 days after, like,
right.
That is a good tip. So you also mentioned you like to dehydrate them for preservation purposes. Have you tried anything else? Like, have you tried other ways to preserve them for long-term use?
Not really, because drying is really, I mean, they'll keep for years if they're in an airtight container. So for me, long-term storage usually equals dehydrating, because you can still reconstitute them. You just put them in the dried ones in a bowl of really hot water for about 10 or 15 minutes, and they'll reconstitute themselves, and you can put them in ramen or whatever you want, or cook them in a skillet or whatever. But dehydrating also, you can grind them up and use them as a powder or seasoning as well. So I just think it's a really easy way to store them, because as long as they're in an airtight container that is in a cool, dark place, they'll last for years. And I actually have a closet in the house that I've taken over, much to my wife's chagrin, for my storage area, and I just keep all my jars in there. And I bought one of those sealers for the jars, because I use like ball jars, but I have the little sealer you put on top, and it'll suck the air out of and it'll seal the lid, and then you just keep them in the closet, and they're good for a while.
Okay, so I was gonna ask that how long they're good for, but you actually use like so it's one of those vacuum sealers that will work with the jars, basically.
Yep, it's a jar vacuum sealer. There's a whole bunch of them out there. There's some really expensive ones, like over $100. But I actually just bought it like a week ago, and it's really cool, and I love it. I don't know how long it's going to last, because it was like $30 on Amazon. But I was just going to try it out and see if I like it first before I invest a whole bunch of money into a really nice one. Sometimes I just think sometimes you pay for nothing. You can get just as useful of a tool for. Sometimes you get what you pay for. Other times, not so much. But
we'll see how. Let us know.
Yeah, we'll see how it works out. But yeah, it just basically sucks all the oxygen out of the jar, so it keeps it fresher for longer. But even if you don't do that, as long as you keep it in a sealed like ball jar with the canning lid in the rim that you put down on that, even if you don't have the vacuum sealer, they will still stay fresh for a couple of years. Just usually, if you make sure that they're completely dry, you have to make sure they're absolutely dry.
They're completely dry when they really crunch, right? They break like chip.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. They're brittle, they're hard, they're crunchy. And then also for my personal stuff, I bought it was like a pack of 200 or 300 for like $10 on Amazon of the food safe silica gel packs. I just tossed one of those in there.
Oxygen absorbers. Yeah.
Yeah. And then put it in there as well. It just helps keep it a little fresher, and they're super inexpensive. So
yeah, that's a good idea. Sweet. And I know
you noticed, oh, go ahead, Poldy.
I was just going to say, you can freeze them, but you want to cook them a bit first, like sweat them, get some of that moisture out of them, and then vacuum seal them that way. That works too.
Yeah, I've never tried that method before. I do freeze some of my mushrooms, but that is not one that I've tried to freeze. That's an interesting method. I'll have to give it a try. And that's part of that onion, right? One layer is preparation and storage. It's just like, how many different ways can I cook this? How many different ways can I incorporate into my diet or my everyday meals?
Right.
And it's really cool thing to explore, because some mushrooms, like chicken of the woods, is my favorite mushroom. I talk about it a lot if you haven't noticed. It's very versatile. It's a great meat substitute, and you can freeze it raw, and it comes out thawed, and it keeps its structural integrity. It keeps its flavor. It does really well frozen raw. And so I vacuum pack mine and put it in the freezer. I still have some from last year. It'll stay good for a year or so. And it's just super easy to just thaw some out and cook it and have it when you don't have fresh to cook. So that's how I kind of make it last for a while.
I wish we had those out here.
Well, Lindy, we're going to Wisconsin.
So easy.
You guys don't have chicken there?
I mean, we do it's the one on Conifers, but I've never seen it, and I've never I've walked a lot through the woods. I've never seen it. And but we are going back to Wisconsin, so in the summer now, if we get lucky, Lindy, it's literally, you'll see a tree trunk that's just orange if you get real lucky, packed with chicken of the woods.
I found my biggest find last year was about 20 pounds on one tree.
Wow.
I didn't send it to you, but it's actually on my Instagram and TikTok pages. It was 4 days worth of growth. I found it on this down tree, and I found that it was pinning. I mean, they were just teeny tiny pins. And I'm like, okay, I'll come back. And we actually went out of state we went on a fishing trip on a long weekend with my wife's family to Michigan. And we got back 4 days later, and I went to check on him, and it was just the most beautiful flush of chicken of the woods you've ever seen in your life. And from 4 days, from pin to absolute feast, it's gorgeous. And it's like one of my favorite videos. I did one of those short videos where you show the picture of it like pinning, and then it flashes to the growth and back and forth. And it's just amazing to see what 4 days of growth can do. They grow really fast.
That's a good point with oysters too. Like if you find one, it's small, you're like, I'm going to come back in a week. You should probably come back in 2 days, because they'll be way
2
bigger.
to 3 days. Yeah. Especially if you're on like where I'm at in the public land, there's all kinds of people walking through there looking for mushrooms and stuff. So if you find it decent size, you may want to take it and not wait, because it probably won't be there next time you come back.
I definitely already made that mistake this year. I left the first bunch of oysters I found by myself on my own solo foraging trip.
There you go.
It was a huge bunch of them. I went back a couple days later, and it was growing up another mushroom. I was like, okay, I'll leave it, so I'll get another, giant one. And the next day I went back, and it was gone. Somebody came through and ripped it off. Yeah.
Either somebody or something.
Yeah.
Deer love mushrooms. Deer eat a lot of different mushrooms. And turtles love morels, by the way. Turtles love morel mushrooms. Yeah. So if you see box turtles around, yeah, they'll munch down on some morels. So
I might have a new spot.
Yeah. So you keep that in mind as well. But yeah, that giant tree, it was about 20 pounds. I only took about a third the first time I found it after I came back for the 4 days. And I left the rest because it was only about 20 feet off a trail. Like, it was really easy. And, chicken of the woods is bright orange and yellow, or at least Laetoporus sulphureus is. Cincinnatus is a little more muted in color, but
faded. Yeah.
So I left it for somebody else, and I came back like 3 or 4 days later, and it was still there. And I'm like, snooze, you lose. So I took more and left a little bit behind, and it was still there this spring. And I'm looking forward to going back there. Last time I found it like that was in September. So I'm going to hopefully keep an eye on that if I'm able to, and hopefully find me another big flush this year.
That's awesome. So what you're saying though for Morelston is follow the turtles. Follow the turtles.
Yeah. Yes. And unfortunately that means you have to walk very slow, which is why I don't follow the turtles.
Yeah. That's why I haven't found as many morels. Yeah.
Right.
It's funny.
It'd be a good way to get a pet turtle and take him on a walk.
Yeah, there you go.
They've got scent dogs and everything.
Yeah, truffle dogs. You could have a truffle turtle. It may just take you 5 days to get there, but you'll get there eventually.
The biggest secret of the commercial morel pickers that we're just exposing here right now.
Turtles. That's awesome. So what are some of your favorite ways to cook oyster mushrooms in the kitchen?
Yeah, so I suck at cooking, first of all. So luckily, my wife is a very good cook. So she cooks them for me. She doesn't really care for mushrooms too much, but she's actually liked a few things that she's tried. So she is trying, but she's not nearly as affectionate about them as I am. But yeah, they are really good in like a stir fry. Oyster mushrooms are really good in a stir fry. Give some nice flavor and texture. Any kind of an Asian dish I like to use them in, like you can use them in ramen, you can use them in all kinds of things. That's probably the easiest thing to do is saute them just in a pan. Just saute them in a little bit of butter and a little bit of salt and pepper. Very basic. But one of my favorite things I did this year was the spring I found a few morels, and I'd found some oyster, and I also had found some ramps. And so I kind of put that all together in a little skillet and kind of just cooked that with a little bit of butter and salt and pepper. And it was glorious. I love that. Just like as its own kind of standalone side dish. It wasn't really in anything, but
it's like the ultimate spring combo. The only thing missing is some fiddleheads and maybe some trout.
Yeah, there you go. I've never found fiddleheads.
Do you have them in Indiana?
I've heard that we have them. I've never seen them. Even at my state park that I'm close to, they said that they have found some, but most of the type of ferns that are out there aren't the right type, because I guess fiddleheads specifically are a certain type of fern, not just any fern. But I don't know a whole lot about them. But I do know that they are around. I've just never found them myself.
Yeah,
so.
Ostrich fern fiddlehead is what you want to look up if you've never heard of them and or you're listening right now and want to learn about them. And that sounds very good. Your morel, ramps, and oyster combo there. We're all fans here of keeping things super simple. That's how I like to eat my stuff. Like let the ingredients speak for itself.
Right.
One thing, though, that we love to do with oysters is turn them into French fries. So, this is, you can actually, so you cut them like French fry slices, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Take a lot of butter or tallow or something, and maybe get like a French fry seasoning or something, but really cook them well, like to the point where other people would probably say
they're a French fry.
Yeah. to the point where other people would be like, this is too much. And
or on the verge of being too much.
Yeah.
You don't want them to be black and crunchy, but like crispy, like a French fry.
most people like to like saute their oysters and they're still like malleable. And I like to put a good crisp on them, take them out, put them in some paper towel, pat and dry. And then I sprinkle on some salt at the very end and kind of toss it around. And they will, if you let them sit for a bit, they'll kind of harden up and they'll like the perfect low carb French fry.
Wow. So good.
Yeah, so good. I don't know if you've
That's
ever
cool.
done that,
I've never tried that. I do some cooking videos on my socials for mushrooms. Luckily, my wife helps me do those because, again, I cook like Hamburger Helper is gourmet for me, right? I'm terrible at cooking.
Love it.
But I can follow a recipe, but the problem is I'm a perfectionist when it comes to that, and so it like takes me forever because I'm like scraping stuff and making sure it's exactly level on the measuring cup, and it's just like
we're very opposite.
Really, yeah, and so like for me, it's not fun because for me it's work. I just got to make sure everything's exact. It's just not my thing. So thankfully, she is a very good cook, and she helps me do my videos for the food prep videos especially, and every once in a while she'll help me record her. She's out with me, so she's an awesome helper. I could do a lot of it without her.
That's right. You got to have a foraging partner, and then maybe one of the two can know or knows how to cook. But like I said, keep it simple. Like don't overthink it. Now, one more thing I wanted to mention for cooking that I learned recently about oysters is that if you do get an older one and it can get a bit tough sometimes. They can get a bit, like you were saying, like when you cut them and they make that squeaky sound, like sometimes they're a bit more dried out, like tougher. Yeah. You can actually pound them like a steak and tenderize them that way if they're big enough. I read that in a book recently, so I haven't really tried it yet.
Good idea.
That's something to try out. Yeah.
Usually overall, if I find them tougher, I dry those. Those are the ones that I'll dry and powder. Same thing with pheasant back. If it's pheasant back has a really short window of when it's edible, and if it is, it's usually just the outer margin. There's too much chitin built up in the mushroom, and it's just like your teeth will bounce off of it. But you can still dry it and powder it. You can still, some people even use it to make mushroom jerky. I've never tried it with oysters, but it could work, I suppose, if you want to give it a try. But
mushroom jerky sounds really good.
That is good. But here's a hot tip with pheasant backs. Sorry, I got a burp here. Use a mandolin slicer. Cut them really, really thin.
Yes.
That's the best way I've found to eat them.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, the thinner you cut them, the more you can break down that chitin with the heat, But I like to saute those in a pan with some onions and put them on hamburgers. Yeah, that's one of my favorite things to do with those.
Yeah.
Very cool. Moving a little bit into the medicinal side of things, are there any medicinal properties that you know of for oyster mushrooms?
There are a couple, not a whole lot to my knowledge, but I found that there was a study back in 2015 that was done with a hot water extract of the oyster mushrooms. It is shown to have antibacterial properties against like Staphylococcus aureus. If with like a hot water extraction, so you would make basically like a mushroom tea, or if you use it to make a soup with or something like that, would be considered a hot water decoction.
I've seen that study too. Yeah, I'll link that.
Okay.
If it's the same one we're talking about, I'll link it in the show notes for people.
I'm trying to remember where I found that. I think it was actually in Adam Harriton's video, I think, but I can't remember that for sure. So don't quote me on that. But yeah, that's the only thing that I have found medicinally for the oyster mushroom specifically. But I think of medicinal a little differently when a lot of people, I mean, of course, medicinal is like things that you do to improve your health, but just what you eat can also be medicinal in a way. You're feeding your body whatever you're eating, so you're fueling your body with that. So if you're getting good nutrition, that can be good medicine, just like taking something,
Definitely.
whatever. but there are a lot of mushrooms out there that have anti-cancer properties and a lot of great things to them. But there's not a whole lot that I know of specifically about the Pleurotus genus that has anything other than that.
There is some literature out there. I didn't dive too deep into it, but I saw a good amount of studies. So if someone really likes to nerd out about that, there is stuff out there, and kind of going off what you just said, like feeding your body with nutrients. I mean, that's a big message I want to get across with my content in the podcast, is like,
exactly,
you are what you eat, and like you're fueling your body, and focus on getting really nutrient dense foods into you. And I did find a study here, actually, or an article, a scientific one, on the nutrition in the oyster. So I just want to read that real quick. And I think they kind of touch on some of the medicinal stuff too. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Yeah. So it's called Oyster Mushrooms, Pleurotus Species, and Natural Functional Food. It's from December 2017 in the Journal of Microbiology, Biotechnology, and Food Sciences by, I'm going to say this name so wrong. Sorry, Mr. Scientist. Adegoke Adebayo et al. There's two authors on here. I will put it in the video so you guys can see who wrote it, and I'll link it below too in the description. But just reading off the abstract here, I'm going to quote it. They say that oyster mushrooms, Pleurotus species, is commercially important in the world mushroom market. It is widely cultivated and consumed in different parts of the world. Many people admire the mushroom due to its taste, flavor, high nutritional values, and some medicinal properties. Pleurotus are generally rich in proteins with essential amino acids, psychologically important polysaccharides, and essential fatty acids, dietary fibers, important minerals, and some vitamins. The presence of some bioactive substances, majorly polysaccharide protein complex in the genus Pleurotus, has been reported to confer some pharmacological potential such as antimicrobial, antioxidant, anti-cancer, and anti-inflammatory, anti-hypercholesterolemia, anti-hypertensive, anti-diabetic, hepatoprotective, and anti-allergic activities. That's a lot. The high nutritional value.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah. The high nutritional value and potential medicinal uses suggest that the oyster mushrooms are pharmacologically important as functional foods. So like I said, I will link it below. But definitely, mushrooms, people forget that mushrooms are actually pretty decent in terms of the proteins they have, and especially some of the essential amino acids that your body can't produce itself in large amounts, or sometimes not at all. So the oyster has some of those essential amino acids in it that we all need. So definitely some nutrition in there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, there's all kinds of good nutrition out there in nature for us. It always amazes me how much is out there, and I won't get off subject too much, but there's a lot of stuff that it just blows your mind that's out there for us to use, from tree bark to plants and mushrooms and all kinds of things that you can use to help vitamin deficiencies and other ailments like that, and to also help fight stuff like cancer. It's crazy to me what's out there and available to us. We just need to learn and just need to pursue it.
Definitely.
Totally. And what's always interesting to me is the whole foods. And if you ever want to nerd out about this, look into, what is it? Nutritional dark matter, I think they call it. And it's all about these vitamins, minerals, micronutrients that we haven't even discovered yet, haven't explored, and how they all work together with the nutrients we already know about in a whole food, and how that combination of all those actually acts on your body. Because most studies are all about one vitamin, one mineral, and how do those affect certain things. But that combination of them in a food, and digesting that together, kind of seeing how that acts on us as humans and animals and whatever. That's really still an unexplored field, and that is why I'm a huge fan of eating whole foods primarily, because I think that there's a ton of benefits out there that we might not have the scientific studies for yet, but that are having an effect.
Absolutely. And I'm getting old, Poldy. I put a 4 in the tens column a couple years ago, so I'm getting up there. And so I didn't take care of my body very well in my younger years. As you can tell, I didn't get kidnap resistant by eating good food. But I can tell you, like, since I started eating cleaner foods and more foods from nature, I just feel better in general. I'm not saying I can run a 6-minute mile now because I eat mushrooms, but I can say that I feel more energetic. I feel more physically just better in general. And even sometimes mentally as well. Like it helps bring some mental clarity. Another mushroom, as far as mental stuff is concerned, lion's mane, Hericium erinaceus, is one of the most studied mushrooms out there that will help with cognitive health. And so I have a dual extraction tincture that I made that I take every day for that. And I'm not saying I'm going to be able to do complex geometry after I can take this, but I can tell you that I just feel better. I just feel better in general. And so, like you said, you can't quantify some of that, but that doesn't mean it's not real, and it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean it's just this ethereal thing that that it just happens. I mean, there's a science behind it. We just don't know how to explain it yet.
Yeah, I really believe in that. So with that tincture, how do you usually approach making your own mushroom tinctures?
I have a couple of friends. One is a two of them are clinical herbalists, and one of them actually is focused on mushrooms. They teach like mushroom tincture classes and stuff like that. So I learned a lot from them. There are some good YouTube videos out there about some of that as well. So the internet is great and terrible at the same time. There's really good content and there's some really not great content out there. So you kind of have to pick and choose your sources. But if you can befriend someone who knows all of those things, most of them are, if they want to be your friend and they're nice, then they'll teach you those things. Cause I mean, they're usually as passionate as you are about it and they want to help people learn. And so they'll spill the beans, man. There's no secret sauce here. Like, here's how you do it. And, they'll help you. A foraging account that I follow out in Colorado, actually, she has a laboratory out there and stuff. And so she's helped me test some of my stuff for potency and stuff like that. Just to, help me along and show, okay, you didn't do this. So this is why, because that's one thing, again, a lot of beginning people, they think they have to know everything, and that's not true. It's one of those things that, making mistakes is just part of life. I often say that failure is not a personality characteristic. Failure is something that happens in your life when you try something new.
Right.
Just because you fail something doesn't mean you are a failure. It just means you're learning. Failure is an often necessary component to success, despite what we want to say about that. We all want to do it right the first time, every time, but that's just not reality. So you're going to mess up. You're going to mess up a batch of tincture and you're going to have to start over. It's just part of the learning process.
Right. Yeah. And you usually just do like an alcohol extract, put in some vodka, somewhere along the lines of that.
Depending on what you're trying to extract, with lion's mane, there are some components of lion's mane that are alcohol soluble, and there are other components that are water soluble. The polysaccharides, for example, are water soluble. So actually, you extract it twice, a dual extraction. You do a hot water decoction, and then you do an alcohol extraction, and then you mix them together into one tincture. You get the benefits of both the water soluble and alcohol soluble properties.
Okay.
Some mushrooms are like that, other ones are not, and so are plants. There are plants that have both water soluble properties. If you make a hot tea or something with that, you can get those benefits, and some of them are alcohol soluble. So you can tincture them in. It depends on what the stuff that you're trying to extract. Some of it you can even burn it up if you use too strong of an alcohol. So usually, most of the time, you either use vodka because it's 80 proof or 40%. And then there are some that need stronger alcohol, and that's when you use like Everclear or a stronger proof alcohol to pull some of that out if it's a really tough chemical to extract. And there's a lot of good books and resources out there for what you should use and what you shouldn't use when doing tinctures and extractions and stuff like that. And so just buy some books and just dive in and again, try and find somebody that you trust, that knows what they're talking about, that can help you out.
So that's that's really interesting, because we're just getting into all the medicinal things. Like Lindy is especially interested in that, and I wasn't aware of, like, I knew there was water extract, I knew there was alcohol extract. I wasn't aware of them targeting different nutrients or different chemicals and whatnot. So we'll have to do more research into that. People listening, you can do more research.
That's another layer to the foraging onion, as I say.
Yeah, that's right.
Never ending onion.
The medicinal layer. That's a whole layer to learn.
Well, maybe we'll do a whole nother podcast on that, but we hit a hour 30 mark now, which I think is pretty good.
Yeah.
That went quick.
Sure did.
So that was
fun, though.
It's been a super fun chat with you, Tim. Before we get going, just like, is there anything we didn't ask you? I want you to definitely like plug where people can find you.
Sure.
And learn more about what you do. But like, is there anything about oysters or foraging that we didn't ask you now that you really want to get out to the people?
Not really, but I do want to like restate what you were saying earlier. Like, get out there and do it. That's the thing. Like, don't be scared. You have plenty of resources at your disposal. You have books, you have the internet, you have Facebook groups, you have naturalists at your state parks and agriculture extension offices, and there's a lot of people that you can learn from. And so just make sure and just do it. Just get out and explore your world. That's kind of I don't say that at the end of every video. I used to, but that's something that I want to do, is just inspire you to get out and start. Just start where you are. It's okay, wherever that is, and just work from there. And just don't let the barrier to entry be so high that you just miss out on all this cool stuff. It's okay to start with basically no information. If you've never foraged before in your whole life, that's okay too. There's a lot of good resources out there, so don't let that stop you.
All right.
Absolutely.
And even if it's just like going out to look for mushrooms you'll never eat, just to like take him home and do my spore prints with or something like that. Just get started.
Just picture.
There you go. Look in your backyard. There's so much. I actually found 3 morels in my backyard this year, which I've never found morels in my backyard before, which gave me an excuse to not mow the lawn for a while. My wife finally made me mow. I was just hoping they would come back again. But yeah, there's so much stuff like right in my backyard as I'm looking out my back window here. I mean, there's dandelion, there's red clover, there's white clover, there is creeping Charlie, there is all these different plantain, all these different common things that's pretty much in everybody's lawn that are really good for you, first of all, and easy to find. Like, you don't have to, trek halfway across the country and go to the, Yosemite State Park to find something that you can actually eat in the wild. I mean, you can find it in your own backyard. Start there.
Yeah.
Start small.
Yeah, that's great stuff. It's so true. Well, Tim, so where can people find you? How do they connect with you?
Yeah. So on all my socials, I am at Hoosier Forager, HOOSIER Forager. That is TikTok and Instagram. And I just started a YouTube page a couple of weeks ago, so I don't have a whole lot of videos on there yet, but I'm working on that. Because most of my videos I recorded for Instagram and TikTok were in portrait mode. And while that looks okay on a phone on YouTube, if you watch it on a computer, the resolution isn't so great. So I'm going to have to probably shoot 2 videos per subject if I want to put it on YouTube and my socials. But so I am working on content there as well. So I'm lucky enough to have a username that no one else has. So you can find me on all those platforms at Hoosier Forager. And then I do sell dried mushrooms and herbs and tinctures and salves and stuff that I make. They're all made by hand with love and sustainably, of course. That is at foraged.com. It's like an Etsy for foraged goods. So if you go on there, I have a storefront and you can just keyword search Hoosier and it will pull up all of the stuff that I have. And there's also a link under each one of those to my Hoosier Forager store where you can actually just look at the stuff I have for sale. And there's some cool pictures as well.
Do you have your lion's mane extract there?
I'm working on it. One of my things is I always like to consume what I make first, right? Because I don't want to.
Good practice.
It's like you don't ask someone to do something you're not willing to do. I'm not going to ask someone to consume something I'm not willing to consume myself. So I've been taking this lion's mane extract ever since I made it in, I think it was December or November of last year, just to make sure that it's doing well and all of that good stuff. And so I will probably start bottling that here pretty soon because I made a really big batch. It was like a gallon that I made because I did find a decent sized lion's mane mushroom last year and I used the whole thing. I tinctured the whole thing. So I will be probably selling that soon, but I do not have that one currently on the store, but I'm always adding new stuff as my store is like a physical manifestation or digital manifestation, I guess, of what I'm learning. So once I learn something and I learn the ins and outs of it, I learn how to preserve it, I learn how to consume it. That's when I put it up for sale for other people to learn about. And on the store itself, under each listing, there's a section of how you use it, kind of the description of what it is. Even I dive in a little bit into the medicinal and or culinary benefits or whatever you want to say, and then how you store it under each one of those things. So there's a little bit of educational value in that as well if you want to take a look.
Love it.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I'm excited for your YouTube to see more videos there.
Thanks, man.
We started YouTube too recently, and I'm really banking on YouTube long term. It's fun making the reels and shorts, but I think the true value is still in the long form content, which is why I've always done podcasts. That's where you can really dive deep, and we're doing like more vloggy style stuff. So if you're listening and you haven't checked out our YouTube yet either, it's at Your Plenty Video. And we're just kind of, showing what we're learning and doing it seasonally, like each season. And it's not just foraging. We're also trying to show apartment homesteading, like homestead adjacent stuff, like how can you,
adjacent.
how can you live, how can you learn homesteading skills while not having a homestead, while living in an apartment and renting, because you can start, if that's your goal long-term, a homestead, you can start building skills now,
Yep.
The best
and I've
time
subscribed to that. Yeah, absolutely. The best time to start is right now. I've subscribed to your channel, of course. I smashed that subscribe button.
Woo!
And,
yeah.
But also, there's a whole urban foraging thing too. There are some accounts that all they do is urban foraging. So even foraging in local city parks and things like that, you don't have to have these giant national parks or state parks to go foraging. You can go
right. I got to make sure right now I'm subscribed to yours because I'm always sometimes on your YouTube. So what's your YouTube? Same thing. Hoosier Forager.
Forager.
Because I'm always.
I actually have a short of that chicken video I was telling you about where it shows the 4 days of growth. There's a short of that on there. It's phenomenal how fast it grows.
Just hit the subscribe too.
Oh man,
I'm bad with that sometimes. But some of these like YouTube, I've noticed they don't even really tell you when someone subscribes. Like I don't know if you've noticed that. It's not like Instagram where it gives you always a notification.
Yes. Yeah, it does every once in a while. Like I don't have a lot of subscribers. These days there's people with millions of subscribers. I have like 23. I think you were number 23 because I checked yesterday for the first time in a couple of weeks and I had 22. So I think you're probably number 2. So I don't have a whole lot, but they're the first couple. I did notice that they sent me a notification, like the first 2 or 3 that I got, and then after that, whenever I'd look at my channel, I'd be like, oh, I have like 12. Oh, I've got like 17. But yeah, they don't notify you like
it's
Instagram
for me,
does.
For me, it's not about that anyway. It's like, as long as I'm putting out the content I think is valuable to people and I get feedback that it's valuable, that's the goal. So
that's all that matters, is we're passing it on, man. That's all. That's right. All there is to it. And that's right. Yeah, that'll do work for itself,
Yeah. Cool, man. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Maybe,
of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I got some more cool guests planned for the rest of the year, but maybe come spring we can do another deep dive into another mushroom or plant or something like that.
Yeah, and I would love to even just do like a general foraging episode or something like that, because again, I have like a whole foraging philosophy that kind of shapes how and what I do. The foraging onion, as I mentioned, but
that would be a good one for the winter, maybe later.
Yeah, some pillar values that I always kind of work out of, and because foraging is more than just an activity or a pastime. For me, it's kind of a lifestyle approach. So yeah, there's a whole lot to that.
Yeah, that would be very interesting.
Let's do it. All right, guys.
Man. Sounds good.
Bye-bye.
See ya.
Bye.